On a Wednesday morning in September of 2003, Kyle Brennan stood at the edge of a muddy precipice and watched his career sink into the blue clay of Warren County, Iowa. $650,000 of gleaming yellow Caterpillar 745 articulated truck was buried to the tops of its 6 massive tires, looking less like a piece of state-of-the-art earth-moving equipment and more like a prehistoric animal that had wandered into a tar pit to die. 3 days earlier, it had all seemed so simple. Brennan Excavation, his pride and joy, the company he'd built from a single used backhoe into a multi-million-dollar regional powerhouse, had won the contract for the new Ridgewood Estates development. It was his biggest job yet, a chance to move into the top tier of contractors in the state. The land was tricky, a series of rolling hills and deep ravines that the old-timers had never bothered to farm, but Brennan's GPS-guided laser graders and brand-new fleet could handle it, or so he had thought. The problem started with an unseasonable downpour. 2 inches of rain in an hour, turning the work site into a sea of greasy mud. The driver of the 745, a young kid barely out of trade school, had tried to take a shortcut across a low-lying swale. He'd ignored the survey stakes marking an old springhead, a patch of ground that never truly firmed up. The truck, loaded with 40 tons of rock for a new roadbed, broke through the topsoil crust and sank into the primordial blue clay beneath. It didn't just get stuck, it was swallowed. Brennan, 38 years old and accustomed to solving problems with horsepower and money, had thrown everything he had at it. First, they brought in his biggest dozer, a new Cat D9T, 100,000 pounds of steel and computer-controlled power. The D9 spun its tracks, digging itself into the mire until it too was in danger of being lost. They spent the rest of the day getting the dozer out. The next day, Brennan called in a favor from a competitor, bringing in a second D9. They chained them together, 250,000 pounds of tandem force pulling on 2-inch steel cables. The cables went taut, humming with a vibration you could feel in your teeth. The engines of the dozers roared, black smoke pouring from their stacks. The articulated truck groaned, its frame twisting under the strain. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot, one of the cables snapped, whipping back and shattering the cab window on the lead dozer. The truck hadn't moved an inch. By the third day, desperation had set in. Brennan brought in a 90-ton rotator wrecker from Des Moines, the kind of machine they used to clear semi-truck pileups on the interstate. The bill for that alone was $5,000 just to get it on site. The wrecker operator took one look at the saturated ground, shook his head, and refused to even extend his outriggers. "You put me out there, Kyle," he'd said, his voice flat, "and you'll be paying to recover 2 machines instead of 1. Brennan was hemorrhaging money. The delay was costing him $10,000 a day in penalties. The rental on the stalled equipment was another $2,000. The repairs to the dozer were mounting, but worse than the money was the humiliation. His entire crew was standing around, helpless. The developer was calling every hour, and from the adjacent property, from the porch of a rundown farmhouse on a hill overlooking the whole disaster, an old man was watching. Just sitting in a rocking chair, watching. Let me tell you about Silas Hassel because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Silas was 82 years old and had lived on that same 320-acre parcel his entire life. His grandfather, a German immigrant named Gunther Hassel, had bought the land in 1898, clearing it with mules and dynamite. Silas had seen it all. He'd seen the Dust Bowl turn his neighbor's topsoil into a memory. He'd seen the farm crisis of the '80s put families he'd known his whole life out of business. He had watched the suburbs of Des Moines creep closer and closer, turning fields of corn and beans into cul-de-sacs with names like Pheasant Run and Oak Ridge. He'd watched Kyle Brennan's fleet of shiny yellow machines arrive a month ago and scrape the soil off the adjoining land, leveling hills his family had plowed around for a century. He hadn't complained. It wasn't his way. Silas was a watcher, a man who believed that most problems, if you stared at them long enough, would either solve themselves or reveal their own true nature. And for 3 days he had watched Kyle Brennan fight the blue clay. He saw the dozers fail. He saw the snapped cable. He saw the big city wrecker arrive and then leave without even trying. He knew that patch of ground. His grandfather had called it the Blaue Teufel, the Blue Devil. It was a bottomless pocket of glacial clay fed by an underground spring that never stopped, even in the driest summer. You couldn't fight it with force. The harder you pulled, the deeper it sucked you in. It didn't respond to power. It only responded to patience. On the morning of the 4th day, after watching Brennan's crew stand around for an hour, kicking at the mud and looking defeated, Silas made a decision. He pushed himself up from his rocking chair, his old joints protesting, and walked out to the big machine shed behind his barn. It was a dark, cavernous building, smelling of grease and rust and time. In the far corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, sat the reason his family had survived when so many others hadn't. It didn't look like a tractor, not in the modern sense. It was a brute, a mechanical beast of black iron, all exposed gears and massive, wide steel tracks. It was a 1920 Holt 10-ton artillery tractor. Let me tell you about that machine. It wasn't built for farming. It was born from the mud and horror of the First World War. In 1917, the U.S. Army needed something that could haul their heaviest artillery pieces, the massive 8-inch howitzers and 155mm guns, through the shell-pocked, rain-soaked battlefields of France. No wheeled vehicle could do it. So they turned to the Holt Manufacturing Company of California, the pioneers of the continuous track-laying vehicle. The machine they built was a masterpiece of single-minded engineering. It had a 4-cylinder engine that idled at a rumbling 300 revolutions per minute and produced only 75 horsepower, less than a modern pickup truck. But it delivered that power through a transmission and a set of final drives so massively overbuilt, so geared down for pure pulling power, that it could generate an astonishing 10,000 pounds of force at the drawbar. It wasn't designed for speed. Its top gear was a brisk walking pace. It was designed for one thing and one thing only: to get an unbreakable grip on the worst ground imaginable and pull until the world moved. Its long, wide tracks gave it a ground pressure of just over 4 pounds per square inch, less than the foot of a walking man. It didn't dig into the mud. It floated on top of it. Silas's grandfather had bought it in 1922 from a government surplus auction for $300. He'd used it to clear the last of the timber from his land, pulling stumps that had defeated 6-mule teams. Silas's father had used it to drag their first house to a new foundation. Silas himself had used it only a handful of times in his life, for tasks that required not speed or brute force, but the slow, relentless application of irresistible torque. He checked the oil, filled the grease cups, and primed the carburetor. He pulled on the big flywheel, his old muscles straining. On the third pull, the engine coughed, belched a puff of black smoke, and settled into its characteristic low-frequency chug, 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 a sound that hadn't been heard in that valley for 20 years. He climbed into the simple iron seat, pushed the clutch, engaged the lowest gear, and rumbled out into the daylight. The sound of it carried across the construction site. It was so different from the high-pitched whine of modern diesels. It was a deep, guttural heartbeat. Kyle Brennan and his crew turned to watch as the strange black machine crawled down the farm lane and onto the edge of their work site. It moved slowly, its steel tracks clanking, leaving a wide, shallow imprint on the soft ground. Silas brought it to a stop 20 yards from the mired truck and shut it down. The sudden silence was deafening. He climbed down, a stooped figure in faded overalls, and walked towards Brennan. Kyle watched him come, a bemused smile spreading across his face. His crew, a half-dozen young men in clean work boots and company-logoed sweatshirts, began to snicker. "Can I help you, old-timer?" Brennan asked, his voice dripping with the kind of condescending politeness reserved for children and the senile. Silas ignored the tone. He looked past Brennan at the buried truck, then at the deep ruts carved by the D9S, then back at the truck. "You're pulling from the wrong place," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "And you're pulling too hard." Brennan's smile widened. He crossed his arms over his chest, a posture of pure, unassailable confidence. "Is that so? And I suppose you and that thing," he gestured dismissively at the Holt, "are going to get it out?" The crew behind him erupted in laughter. One of them called out, "Hey, be careful. You might scratch the paint on that museum piece." Silas didn't even glance at them. His eyes were fixed on Brennan. "Your machines are built for horsepower," he said, his voice calm and even. "They're meant to move dirt fast. This," he nodded back towards the Holt, "was built for drawbar pull. There's a difference. It doesn't yank. It just leans. Your dozers have a high ground pressure. They dig their own graves in this kind of mud. That machine spreads its weight. It'll walk right over to it." Brennan let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a laugh of genuine disbelief, the sound of a modern, educated professional confronted with what he saw as peasant superstition. "Ground pressure? Drawbar pull? What is this, 1930? Look, Grandpa, I appreciate the offer, but I've got 200,000 pounds of the most advanced dozers on the planet that couldn't budge it. That thing will fall apart if you even hook a chain to it. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known, with a certainty that settled deep in your bones, that you could solve a problem that had stumped the experts? Have you ever had to stand there and listen to people laugh at the very idea that your old way, your quiet knowledge, could possibly compete with their new, expensive, and utterly failed methods? That was the moment Silas Hassel found himself in. He wasn't an arrogant man. He wasn't looking for glory. He just saw a problem and knew the shape of the key that would fit the lock. He looked at Kyle Brennan's smug, confident face, and he felt a flicker not of anger, but of pity. The boy was blind, blinded by newness, by cost, by the belief that more expensive always meant better. "It won't fall apart," Silas said, his voice still quiet. "And it won't pull from the frame. You're trying to drag 40 tons of dead weight and another 60 tons of suction. You don't pull the truck, you pull the wheels, one at a time." He pointed at the massive tires. "You wrap a cable around the inside of each rim, run it through a block and tackle, and you turn the wheels. Let the truck's own gearing help you. You're not lifting it, you're just helping it drive out." The engineering of it was simple, elegant, and completely lost on Kyle Brennan. He heard block and tackle and pictured old sailing ships. He shook his head, the smile finally fading from his face, replaced by irritation. "I don't have time for this, Pop. I've got real work to do." He turned to walk away. "Suit yourself," Silas said to his back. "Just thought I'd mention it. That clay sets up like concrete after a few days in the sun. You got about 24 hours before that truck becomes a permanent part of the landscape." Brennan stopped. He turned back slowly. He looked at the silent, helpless truck. He looked at the faces of his crew who had stopped laughing and were now watching him, waiting for a decision. He looked at the sky, where the sun was beginning to burn through the morning haze. He was out of options. The thought of the humiliation of having to call the Caterpillar dealer and admit he'd lost one of their machines was sickening. "Fine," he snapped, the word cracking with frustration. "Fine. You want to play with your antique toy, go ahead. But when it breaks in half, you're paying to haul the scrap off my property. Don't expect any help from my crew." "Wouldn't need it," Silas said. He turned and walked back to the Holt, the quietest victor you ever saw. Brennan stood there, arms crossed again, a sour, knowing smirk plastered on his face, ready to watch the old fool make a spectacle of himself. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours, because they are the reason this story is still being told in Warren County. Silas didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who has performed the same motions his entire life. First, he unbolted a heavy steel plate from the back of the Holt, revealing a capstan winch, a vertical drum powered directly by the tractor's transmission. This was another piece of its military heritage, designed for tasks that required more finesse than the drawbar could offer. Then he walked back to his machine shed. He didn't come back with a single thick steel cable like the ones Brennan had snapped. He returned on a small farm wagon pulled by a garden tractor, and on the wagon was a collection of what looked to Brennan like junk. A half-dozen massive, rust-pitted steel pulleys, their wheels thicker than a man's fist. Several coils of wire rope of varying thickness, and a pile of heavy-duty logging chains. Brennan's smirk returned. This was going to be even more pathetic than he'd imagined. Silas ignored him. He spent the first hour not even touching the stuck truck. Instead, he drove a heavy steel anchor pin deep into the ground, 50 yards to the left of the truck, near a stand of old oak trees. He wrapped a chain around the base of the largest oak, a tree that had been there since the Civil War, creating a second anchor point. He was building a web. He wasn't going to pull the truck out. He was going to squeeze it out. He ran his main cable from the Holt's capstan winch to the anchor pin, through one of the massive pulleys and back to the oak tree. From the oak, through another pulley, he ran a second cable towards the front of the stuck truck. He was creating a system of force multipliers, a block and tackle on a gargantuan scale. Every pulley he added doubled the pulling force of the Holt, trading speed for power. His crew watched in confused silence. This wasn't how you did recovery. You hooked the biggest thing you had to the stuck object and you pulled. This was math. It was physics. After nearly 2 hours of methodical preparation, Silas was finally ready. He took a heavy logging chain and, just as he'd said, wrapped it not around the truck's frame, but around the rim of the front right tire, carefully feeding it between the tire and the fender. He connected this chain to his complex web of pulleys. He climbed back onto the Holt's iron seat. The chugging engine hadn't varied its rhythm once. "Stay clear," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the quiet air. Brennan made a show of waving his crew further back, as if expecting an explosion. Silas took a breath, looked out over the scene he had so carefully constructed, and then he gently engaged the winch clutch. The capstan began to turn, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The slack in the network of cables began to disappear. One by one, they rose from the mud, dripping water and clay. They tightened. A low groaning sound began to fill the air, a symphony of stressed steel. The big oak tree creaked. The anchor pin in the ground tilted a few degrees and then held fast. For a long moment, nothing else seemed to happen. The Holt's engine didn't strain. Its rhythm remained steady, hypnotic. Chug, chug, chug. Brennan's smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. He glanced at his watch. Then a shudder. It was small, almost invisible, but everyone saw it. A tremor ran through the massive $500,000 truck. The groaning of the cables rose in pitch. The front right wheel, the one Silas had chained, began to turn. It wasn't being pulled out of the mud. It was being rotated, forced to climb its way out of the hole it was in. A collective gasp went through Brennan's crew. The wheel turned a few inches, its deep treads biting into the clay wall of its prison. The entire truck shifted, lifting a fraction of an inch on its suspension. The suction of the blue clay made a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of wet canvas. Silas didn't change his expression. He just sat there, one hand on the winch lever, feeling the strain through the machine, letting the Holt do what it was born to do. He let it lean. For 10 minutes he pulled, and for 10 minutes the wheel slowly, painstakingly turned, dragging the corner of the truck up and forward. When it had turned a full quarter rotation, he disengaged the winch. He got down, moved the chain to the next wheel, re-rigged his cables, and started again. Back left wheel, front left, back right. Each time the process was the same. A slow tightening, a groan of steel, and a shuddering movement as the truck was forced to participate in its own rescue. It took another hour. With each wheel he turned, the truck rose higher out of the mud, the terrible suction of the clay broken. By the time he had turned all 4 of the truck's main drive wheels, the machine was listing, but it was nearly free. For the final pull, Silas disconnected his block and tackle system. He backed the Holt directly in front of the truck, hooked a single, thick chain to the front tow hooks, and returned to his seat. This was the moment of truth. He engaged the main clutch, not the winch. The Holt's tracks dug in, the steel grousers finding purchase where the D9S had only found slurry. The tractor squatted down on its haunches like a great black beast. The chain snapped taut. The Holt's engine note deepened, the chugging slowing as it took the full strain, but it did not falter. And the Caterpillar 745, the $650,000 marvel of modern engineering, began to slide forward. It moved slowly at first, trailing great sheets of blue clay, the sound of the suction finally letting go echoing across the valley. Then it was rolling, free and clear on solid ground. Silas pulled it another 50 feet for good measure and then stopped. He disengaged the clutch. The sudden release of tension was as dramatic as the pull itself. He climbed down from the seat and began unhooking the chain, as if he'd just finished pulling a plow. Brennan's crew, who had been watching in absolute, stunned silence, erupted. They yelled, they cheered, they applauded. They ran up to the old Holt, touching its warm engine block, staring at its simple, powerful construction with a reverence they usually reserved for their own machines. And Kyle Brennan just stood there. He went pale. His arms, which had been crossed in defiance for 3 hours, dropped to his sides. His mouth hung slightly open. He stared at the rescued truck, then at the ancient black tractor, then at the old man coiling a chain as if it were the most ordinary day of his life. Everything he thought he knew about power, about progress, about the very nature of work, had just been dismantled before his eyes by an 82-year-old man and a machine that should have been scrapped before he was born. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with the pull. The next morning, Kyle Brennan drove his clean Ford F350 down Silas Hassel's bumpy farm lane. He found the old man in his workshop, methodically cleaning the mud from the Holt's tracks with a wire brush. Brennan got out of his truck holding a checkbook. He walked up to Silas, who didn't stop his work. "Mr. Hassel," Brennan said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. I don't know what to say." Silas finally stopped and looked up at him. "You don't have to say anything. Just learn something is all." Brennan swallowed hard. "I came to pay you for the recovery. Name your price. Whatever it is, it's a bargain." He opened the checkbook. Silas held up a greasy hand. "Don't want your money." "But I have to," Brennan insisted. "My company policy, my insurance. I have to compensate you." Silas thought for a moment. "You really want to pay me?" "Yes, sir, absolutely." "All right. There's a little museum in town, the Warren County Historical Society. They're trying to fix the roof on the old schoolhouse. Leaks every time it rains. They need about $8,000. He looked Brennan square in the eye. "Write them a check for 10 and tell them it's in memory of Gunther Hassel. He went to that school." Brennan stood there for a long moment, checkbook in his hand. Then he smiled, a genuine smile this time. He wrote the check, tore it out, and handed it to Silas. "How?" Brennan asked, the question he'd been holding in since the day before. "How did you know that would work?" "Wasn't about knowing," Silas said, turning back to his work. "It was about remembering. That machine wasn't designed by engineers with computers. It was designed by blacksmiths and mechanics who had to get guns through the mud in France. They understood that some problems don't need more power. They need better thinking. Your machines are designed to protect themselves. The computers cut the power before anything can break. That old thing, it doesn't know how to quit. It will either pull the object or it will tear itself to pieces trying. It leaves the decision up to the man in the seat." He tapped the iron fender of the Holt. "Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to forget why they were built in the first place." Kyle Brennan left that farm a different man. He delivered the check to the Historical Society that afternoon and became a lifelong member and benefactor. He started collecting old machinery himself, not shiny restored tractors for parades, but working machines, learning the simple, brutal logic of their design. He became known for taking on impossible jobs, the ones that required more thought than horsepower, and he often succeeded where others failed. Let me tell you one last thing, because this is where the story comes full circle. Silas Hassel passed away in the winter of 2011 at the age of 90. The whole town came to his funeral. Kyle Brennan was a pallbearer. The Holt tractor stayed in the machine shed, maintained by Silas's son, and then by his grandson, a young man named Ben. Fast forward to 2018. Brennan Excavation is now run by Kyle's son, Michael, a sharp kid with an engineering degree from Iowa State. They're laying a fiber optic cable line through that same rough country near the Hassel farm. And one of their new $1 million directional boring machines, a complex marvel of hydraulics and computer guidance, gets its drill head irrevocably stuck in a seam of solid granite 50 feet underground. They tried everything. They tried pulling with a D11 dozer. They tried hydraulic rams. Nothing worked. It was a $250,000 loss staring them in the face. Michael, frustrated and angry, was on the phone, arranging for a specialized salvage crew from Chicago at a cost of $50,000. Kyle, now in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, drove out to the site. He listened to his son's frantic plans, then calmly took the phone from his hand and ended the call. "Wait here," he said. He made a call of his own. An hour later, a familiar chug, chug, chug echoed from down the road. Ben Hassel, Silas's grandson, came rumbling into view on the 1920 Holt 10-ton artillery tractor, looking exactly as it had 15 years before. Michael Brennan stared in disbelief. "Dad, what is this? You can't be serious. We need a modern salvage rig, not a relic from a junkyard." Kyle Brennan just put a hand on his son's shoulder and smiled that same genuine smile he'd learned from an old man in a workshop years ago. He looked at the ancient black machine, a living piece of history ready to go to work, and he looked at his son, who was blinded by the same modern arrogance that had once blinded him. "Let me tell you about that tractor," he began. "Today, the Holt 10-ton still sits in the Hassel family machine shed. It's nearly 105 years old. Engineers from Caterpillar have visited, taken measurements, and offered staggering sums of money to acquire it for their corporate museum in Peoria. They call it a priceless, one-of-a-kind survivor of their company's origins. Ben Hassel always politely declines. He tells them it's not for sale. It's not a museum piece, he explains. It's a tool. He keeps it greased and fueled, ready to go. Because in the rolling hills of Warren County, there are still problems that money can't solve. Problems that require something more than just power. They require patience and leverage, and the memory of a time when machines were built with the simple, stubborn idea that they should never, ever give up. That's the difference between something that's old and something that endures. It's the difference between a machine that gives up to save itself and one that was built to,